Let me start by making you an offer. First of all, I appreciate the budget, and I appreciate all the administration's doing, and thank you for the very generous words for this committee, which on a bipartisan basis really has tried to prioritize these things under successive chairmen, no matter who was in the majority, and I think we actually have seen some tangible results from sustained attention. And if we can just keep that and broaden that focus, hopefully we can do more. Actually, in terms of, if I can get out of this subcommittee's jurisdiction to my own for a minute, we will later have a hearing on Native American programs that span health and human services. And so I would very much like to work with you and OMB and whatever sort of unitary thing. I know Ms. McCollum's worked for a lot of years trying to identify where all the different streams of revenue are and why can't we put them into an overall budget for Indian country. So at least in the areas where I have jurisdiction, we're going to try and do that, and we want to do it obviously in cooperation with you. So if you can just help us figure out where these things are, where we can bring them together, we're going to have, I think, a difficult appropriations process because, with all due respect, the President submitted a budget, on political assumptions in terms of what's going to pass in terms of taxes that are fantasy. They're not going to happen. I mean, we're more likely to be flat lined. That doesn't mean you can't prioritize within that, and it doesn't mean later there can't be a larger deal. I mean, that's what I would hope for, is another Ryan Murray type situation. Mr. Calvert and I just came from Defense Subcommittee, where I can tell you there's a lot of pretty worried people around that table about the consequences of sequester. But it's not enough simply to write a budget, propose it. You have to have a process to negotiate a settlement, because it's not going to be what's envisioned in the President's budget. But again, the amount of money we're talking about in the jurisdiction I have is a comparatively small amount when you look at how vast it is. So if you would help us identify and figure out how to coordinate that, and matter of fact, if you want to come over and testify, or Secretary Jewell did, or you guys put your heads together, we would love to have that, so it's not just a block here from this and a block here from that, but we had somebody from the administration standpoint that talked about a unitary approach. Is that possible to do?
Chairman, absolutely. We've been noticing so many places in our programs that tribes just aren't able to participate in some program that serves states or other governments or other groups, and so we have been finding lots of places where we just need to make sure that tribes are eligible to apply as well, and so we'd be delighted to help you with that.
Well, let's have that conversation. One quick question, if I may, and could you give us an update? I know we have a number of tribes that are working on VAWA, that are trying to get themselves where they've got the judicial capacity and the law enforcement capacity. How are we doing where the rubber meets the road?
We have, we've got 3 tribes that have taken on pilot programs, but come March, middle of March or so, every tribe in the country that wants to do it can start doing VAWA prosecutions in theory. They have to put a lot of things in place to do that, and so we think that'll go kind of slow at first, because it's quite expensive at the tribal level. We have funding this year in our FY15 budget, I believe, I think it's about $1 million to help train tribal courts so they can handle this so they can, exercise this responsibility very well. So we are desperately training and conducting a lot of training to try to make sure that tribal courts have the resources they need to put that into place properly.
Okay.
We're going to recess for 10.
I'm sorry, first of all, I missed most of your testimony. I apologize. And I'm like Mr. Simpson, I want to read it, but it's pretty easy to catch the flavor of your testimony in both your conclusion and in the questions that have been asked. Couple of questions. When you look at these schools, obviously you're doing, I suppose, a sort of fiscal or physical and fiscal, look. But is there any what are the governance systems for these schools? I mean, we normally would think of a school board and superintendents and school boards. Tell me how they're governed, and tell me, do you see any difference between, if there are, I know, for instance, our friends the Choctaws run their own Jones Academy School. It is an unbelievable school. It is physically first rate. It is wonderful education, and they educate Native American kids from all over, not just Choctaws. And so my experience has been, I've seen this in healthcare systems, the more the tribe is actually the manager of it. Now, we still have resource questions and taxation questions and all that, but if parents can get their hands around the neck of somebody that's responsible, or their tribal legislators have the authority and responsibility and know they'll be held accountable, that tends to make a real difference in how any institution I see is managed. Self-governance actually is usually very, very good.
Well, we can definitely look into that more as we continue on. This is really the midway point for us, and we have more site visits to do as we go forward. I would say that obviously there are differences in terms of how the schools are run, whether they're tribally operated or BIE operated. That said, in terms of facilities management, Indian Affairs does play a significant role in terms of funding for schools, kind of regardless of how they're operated, whether it's BIE operated or tribally run. And Indian Affairs owns the majority of those school facilities, about 2/3. The tribes own about 1/3. So those are some of the things that we've learned so far, and we're going to continue our exploration to see.
We should look at this because, again, particularly in healthcare areas, I don't say this to knock anybody here, or certainly not Indian Health, but where I've seen tribes actively managing, number one, if they have any revenue, they usually shift some of their own revenue into this because it is for their own people. But even beyond that, it just seems to work better, and I would assume the same thing here. So I think this is a governance issue as well as, and I do want to pick up on something that Mr. Simpson suggested and asked you to also look at. I think, there's culture in contracting too, and the history of private contractors working, for the federal government in Indian country throughout the entire history of this country has been bad. This is not a new problem. This is not something that is this administration's fault. Frankly, I want to commend them for trying to get their hands on this and put resources in there and do some innovative things. And this committee very much on a bipartisan basis wants to do that too. But suggestions you could make about, not only this or that, what are the contracting problems? What are the availability of contractors? Many of these places are going to be built in very remote locations. We saw a detention facility with, it clearly had been badly sited, where literally half the building was breaking off. It was an old facility when we were in Hopi country, and this just happens time and time again. So what are the best practices contracting-wise that we can put in? And I guess, are you looking at that as opposed to just it's bad here or that, but how do we actually go about this? How do we choose contractors? Who's responsible?
I think we'll be looking into that, especially given the concerns that we found with some of the contractors that have put in those new roofs. I mean, it definitely raises that issue of accountability, just even on the contractor side or the supplier side. In terms of sort of promising practices, I do want to let you know that as we go forward, we are also going to be looking at some additional models that are being done out there to come up with other ways of managing facilities. For example, in Oklahoma, I know 4 schools came together to jointly fund, I believe it was like 2 architects and a technician to help with their schools. So by having the tribes come together, they were able to jointly fund these positions that were then able to cover more schools. And so we'll be looking at that as an alternative model, and others that schools may be proposing to see if those also offer possibilities for the department to consider, maybe encouraging others to adapt as well.
The last thing I would ask you to look at, or maybe you are looking at it, again, and this goes back to a point Mr. Simpson made, there has to be a means, a punitive means, whether it is civil fines or criminal activity, where when you've got somebody really has the authority and responsibility to go after them. And I think sometimes, people with the best intentions may be in Washington, D.C. and not see it. Somebody on the local ground may see it and not have the ability to do it. How do you again, develop that so that they know when they're dealing with, an Indian school in any state, it's like dealing with one of Mr. Simpson's constituent schools, that, hey, you come in here and mess with our kids, you're going to court, we're going to hold you accountable. If we bankrupt your company, that's what we're going to do. We expect, value for the dollar, and we expect these are our kids going here, that somebody's going to look after them.
Well, we're definitely talking to our lawyers who are very familiar with options available, and we'll be involving them in the report as we go forward to talk about potential remedies.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.